Oh, yeah. What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and I am here with the one and the only Bo Daddy.
Top of the morning to ya.
Oh, yeah. I like hitting the air horn, Bo.
Hey, does the music record on a different track? Did you notice that in our last TNT there was no music or sound drop?
So I have this thing where it records all on one,
Yeah.
but if our levels because I can't tell what I'm listening to is not what is being recorded.
Okay.
So then
Okay.
if our levels aren't the same, or last time like your mic went out or whatever, where
Yeah.
so if I use the program to clean up our vocals,
Okay.
that it pulls out background noise and it thinks half of the sound that's not us talking is background noise. That's what happens.
You were dropping stingers but it wasn't showing up on the actual podcast and it just sounded funny.
Yeah, I sit there going like, I'm either gonna have to go back in and add sound effects or
That's painful.
just get over it.
That
And
is painful.
somehow last week had enough with me to have to get over. So it wasn't hard to add on absence of sound effects.
Hey, are you recovering from Denver?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good. I know
Yeah.
it took a lot out of you to pull that thing off.
Yes. Theology Beer Camp is a large investment. I'll call it the lost leader of homebrewed Christianity. There's nothing quite like all the time and money that goes into that.
Interesting.
It's more of like the community building gathering.
Yeah, that's funny. No, it's a good project, though. It brings together a lot of people.
Yeah, if someone really likes it and is independently wealthy and would like to sponsor it, so no, I won't lose money. That's always exciting.
That would be exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I did a bunch of events when I had grant money. You know how much easier those were when you're a graduate student and you have grant money?
Yeah.
You aren't sitting there going, ooh, I wonder how this is going to work out.
Yeah. I got to be a part of one of those with Big Tent Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
That was fun.
Oh, yeah. Now, Bo, I know, everyone should know Bo just broke into his own office. He got a crowbar.
With that crowbar.
And broke into his own office after terrorizing
surprising a new cleaning person this morning who apparently did it. No one warned them that I show up at 4:35 in the morning, and I scared the bejesus out of them.
Yeah. But so one of us has broke into something this morning. I was just editing things, so it's not nearly as exciting.
That is not as exciting. Yeah, you know what's funny? I it's been a long time, like probably since I was a teenager, that I smashed down a door, and it really is an adrenaline rush, though. I mean, it took me like half hour to come back down.
Well, did you like make a noise when you did it? Like you're like, yeah.
That's a great question.
Or kapow.
I probably was trying. The honest truth is, because this cleaning person was in the building, I was probably trying to make as little noise as possible.
I'm just trying to break down the door quietly.
Yeah, it was already loud enough.
I promise I work here.
I promise I work. Oh my gosh.
And she's like, but you just used a crowbar to open the door.
Oh my gosh. That is hilarious. What if she's like, hey, what if she tells like the company that we, contract through? What if she's like, listen, I just need to let you know this big guy showed up this morning and kicked down a door, but he seemed to like know what he was doing. But I just thought he belonged
there. I thought I don't know. He had on his liturgically colored eyewear and
oh boy. Hey, besides power, which we're talking about this morning,
yeah,
what have you been thinking about lately?
Oh, well, Bo, there was an election recently.
Oh, yeah.
They got me to think of things.
Okay.
I'm putting together, we just kind of announced that this Advent, I'm going to do, the Advent class is going to be on the Theologians of Crisis, which are...
That looks amazing.
Yeah, so like, between the world wars in Europe, there's, obviously they were like, "Oh, junk, I guess we haven't fully evolved as a species."
Uh,
And
despite what Hegel says,
yeah,
we are
just
not.
trenches, machine guns,
Yeah,
poison gas, like, that war really was a shock to kind of
yeah,
European self-understanding,
yeah,
the way the economic and political structures work
yeah,
leads to rampant inflation, and this a lot of cultural tensions in each of the different European nation states, attraction of
yeah.
authoritarian leaders and kind of fascist responses, and coming up with cool ways of cool being sarcastically said here, ways of scapegoating minority populations, things that, were in our past, obviously, Bo.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
well,
You know
the
what?
theologians crisis, Boltzmann, Barth, Tillich,
Mhm,
Bonhoeffer, there was a whole group that was like, this is a we have a problem. We've we've we can't differentiate the story of our nation or the story of the West
mm,
from the story of God. And so I'm like, let's
yeah,
read those theologians,
mm.
and the reading parts are going to be their Advent and Christmas sermons
Oh,
addressing
boy.
the historical moment
Oh, boy.
with a theologian that specializes in each of it, and go, what do they
No.
have to contribute to our moment? So
Wow.
I've been working on getting all that ready this week, editing the
That's so
next
good.
episode of the Bonhoeffer documentary and
Yeah, yeah.
that kind of thing.
2 things. One, I started this around the turn of the century, with the 21st century. I thought it was just fascinating to go back and look at things, theologically 100 years before.
Mhm.
And so this has been just a fantastic thing that I do, for my personal development, but I end up using it a lot in, like, Sunday school, that to help people understand, like, do you understand that 100 years ago, this is what was being taught or thought or
Mhm.
preached, or how we were organizing ourselves? And, like, my favorite one is, because originally, I was ordained with a denomination that started around the turn of the 20th century. And then obviously the events of 1906 with the Azusa Street revival, and then the birth of the Pentecostal movement. And right, so in 2006 I was really looking at that, and as it's progressed. But now that I've become a mainline pastor, one of the things I'm very aware of is that just over 100 years ago, the optimism was so high, especially with the advancements of the social gospel, that they named the 20th century is called the Christian century. It even has its own magazine.
It's got its own magazine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the fascinating thing is you can watch that optimism. So let's say 1924 now. You're going to watch, if I continue doing this, right, for the next 10, 20 years, this massive crisis of confidence settle in, where theologically things change so radically from the triumphalism and the celebratory nature of, I mean, this is anachronistic to call it this now, but post millennialism, right? That we were ushering in the kingdom of God through our civic and social works. It's just the most amazing thing to watch how that disintegrates through the Great Depression, the World War, and then in that interwar period, it all but crumbles in most arenas. It's just a fascinating thing to watch in a 30-year window, the complete disillusionment with that optimism and triumphalism of the turn of the century.
Mhm. Yep. Well, I don't think I was entering 2024 full of optimism, but
Yeah. Well,
I got
but go
I
back
got
and look at
less now.
go back and look at 1924. I
Mhm.
mean, I'm assuming that y'all are gonna do this in this
Yeah.
Advent thing. I It sounds fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's yeah, and I think you're right, like, the part of what happened, I mean, there you were talking about postmillennialism, this kind of view that the church saw itself as part of ushering in, like, the reign of Christ, right? Like,
Yeah.
things are gonna get better, and then we're like, "Oh, junk, the kingdom of God's arrived." Well, one of the side effects of that is, that gets retained in a time of crisis that makes things more problematic is the fusion of your own identity group, nation, race, class, gender, all these kinds of things get fused with the story of God where you can't differentiate the two. So the theologians of crisis,
Oh.
the one of the elements that they share in common is namely like we don't get to tell God who God is. God tells us. God shows up, and God shows up as the divine, comes in and ruptures this breakthrough,
Mhm.
and it addresses us. And what it reveals is that optimism created a kind of idolatry where, in different nation states and in different parts of the church, you came to think like the future of God's coming is somehow intrinsically attached to the future of the German nation state or the Italian.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
um, the theologians of Christ is like emphasis on the otherness of God, the need for divine initiative to generate an encounter with the divine. These kinds of things are there, and they consistently are picking up the theme of idolatry, and that idolatry is one where like our faith gets gets seized, so that we Bart plays with this image in Isaiah, where second Isaiah, Israel, the I think it's the Assyrians at that point, get taken down, right? Like they had, attacked Israel, and second Isaiah is when they get taken down, and Isaiah's like, look, y'all, the Assyrians are having to escape. They got their statue to Nebu, their god, on a donkey. How convenient. You're able to save your god by putting it on your donkey when you go run out of town. And Bart's preaching on this text going like, this is what we're doing. We have created a God that we actually can carry around. It goes around with us, with our nation, or with our commitment to an economic system, or commitment to things that are inherently oppressive to others and exploitative. When your God is something, the person that made it, and it fits on a donkey, or when the nation, which the origin of your nation, and you make it, then we got an idolatry problem. And just because there's a flag of that state in your sanctuary doesn't mean it's not idolatry.
Oh,
And
boy.
so, yeah, but luckily, never mind. I'm going to avoid an aside rant here, Bo. I was about
Yeah,
to get,
okay.
because I know you have an agenda and you're excited about it.
Well, yeah, I have been waiting ever since the, election. By the way, I'm forgetting the name of the theologian Karl Barth wrote 9 against,
Email Bruner.
Bruner, yes. I almost said that, but then I was like, "It doesn't sound right." Um, yeah, just for him for him, the passion with which he was against this liberal optimism and in his famous book, 9! No! So, just they had a funny
Catchy title.
they had a funny rivalry. Ever since this thing went down, uh, I've been thinking about the nature of power. Because unlike the echo chambers like MSNBC and where all of the second guessing, the Monday morning quarterbacking, the hand wringing, just you can listen to that anywhere, okay? And the debriefing about where the Democratic nominee may have gone wrong and why so few people turned out, even though the rallies were amazing and the optics were amazing and the spectacle. And then lots of people are talking about the shortcomings of the Republican nominee, soon to be president again, and and this amazing parade of misfit toys, as I heard it called the other day by a Canadian commentator, of this cabinet that he's putting together. You can hear that stuff anywhere. This is the Theology Nerd Throwdown. And I have a different question I want to put in front of you, and I want to work it through together because it starts with a story about something you taught me
Oh,
about 10 or 12 years ago in your garage. Philip Clayton had just debated Daniel Dennett, and you and I recorded a TNT in your garage on a card table. We used to sit at a card table.
yeah.
And so I have 3 stories for you as we progress through today that I want to build a case about something, and I want to see if it holds up at all. Okay.
All right.
But because it starts with a story about you helping me understand something for the first time, I thought I should start with you. So you're the first person I'm running this by.
Okay.
All
This
right.
is gonna be fun.
So my fascination isn't with how bad the Republican nominee is. My fascination is, why did my friends and family vote for him? Why don't they care about his moral character or his legal woe, right? Any of that. Why don't they care? So this is my haunting question. Not his virtue or lack thereof. Why did they support him? Okay. So here's the story. You said something about, and I think it was started with the New Atheists. We were talking about the New Atheists. And for those that don't know, the New Atheists were like, let's name, they're the four horsemen of the apocalypse, they call themselves, right? So Daniel Dennett was one of them, Sam Harris,
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins, and the guy who passed away. Really smart British guy.
Yeah.
Witty guy.
Oh,
Anyway,
God.
I know, I'm just blanking on his name.
He
Okay.
wrote God is not great.
Right. So somebody will know. But you used this analogy where you said, look, if your goal is to ruin a party at a friend's house, there are like 20, 25, 30 ways to ruin it. And it really doesn't matter how you accomplish it if your goal is to ruin the party, right? You can start a fight. You can spike the punch. You can plug the toilets, right? There's Hitchens. Thank you. So there are tons of ways to ruin a party, cause a fight between a couple, right? All sorts of things. Light the curtains on fire. It doesn't matter, because you introduced me to this idea of secondary motivation, is what I call it, but I don't think it's what you called it. But if you have a secondary motivation, then the primary expression isn't as important as the secondary motivation. Do you remember talking about this at all? Does this sound familiar?
In that, sometimes I'll like in a systems theories, a lot of times the thing isn't the thing. And so there's a kind of, like in a counseling setting, they'll call it the identified patient, where in a whole network of relations, all the anxiety and toxicity of it gets poured out on something. And very rarely is it really the main problem. It's just, well, what can we as a collective decide the problem is? It could be this person, or maybe like our kids' grades, but there are real problems in the marriage, or you think both, like the partners all think the other one hates each other and blah, blah, blah. And it's really, they don't know how to pay all their bills. And so the economic anxieties generate, you go through all these things. And so there's like the thing that gets put front and center. And then there's the whole web of relations that are generating it. And it's often easier to attach, for the majority of the people, to attach their anxiety to something than take responsibility for their place in the relationships.
Wow. Oh yeah. So like, if my goal is to not see you hired as the theology professor at a seminary, if this is my goal, there's 10 different ways that I could bring it about to subvert that, right? I could make a call,
be like, friend, you know what he said when we were in the garage after the mic went off?
I could do a public thing. I could do a private thing. I could personally try and sabotage you, right? It doesn't matter if my goal is for you to not become a theology professor at a seminary before me, because then I would be jealous. Then I could, right? It doesn't matter how I accomplish it to bring it about, as long as I satisfy this secondary, the motivation. All right. So put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it. Second story. Let's say that when you got together with your buddies, y'all liked smoking a pipe. And
reasonable.
yeah. And you romanticize it. And you said, "Oh, I
Oh,
love
yeah.
the weight of the bowl in my hand. I love the smoke rings. The smell makes me feel like I'm in England,
Yeah.
um, where I have such fond memories. The the practice of packing the pipe so that it has the right,
Mhm.
tension and the tobacco's not too loose so it doesn't
Yeah,
burn
you
too
gotta
hot.
fill it up, push it down, fill it
Yep.
up, push it down, fill it up, push
Yeah.
it. It's 3 pushes
Yeah.
for snug,
So I love
optimal, little flake on top, light puff, 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 get the cherry, tap, tap.
Yeah, so I love the tactile, right? I love the ceremony around it, right? And so I have all these lofty words, and I feel like and then I sit around with my buddies, and we feel like we're in the Shire, with a hobbit weed,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and
Feel like you're
so
setting me up for something, Bo.
I feel like I'm in the Lord of the Rings, right? Okay, so then you go on a camping trip with these same guys, and the guy who has such you know, uh, says he loves smoking a pipe, but he brings a pack of cigarettes
Oh.
on the trip, and you say, "That's interesting. I thought you were into pipes." And he says, I didn't want to get it wet, and it takes up too much room in the bag, and it's messy out here, and this is just easier." And you start going, "Well, that's interesting." You go, "So, what do you have in your mouth?" And he says, "Oh, I have a nicotine lozenge." And you realize, I don't know how committed he is to pipes. I think this dude is addicted to nicotine.
Yeah. I
Okay?
I you're a that is a Sherlock move there, Bo.
Right, right. My deductive reasoning there, it's like, good work, Nancy Drew. You solved another mystery. Um, so that's story 2, and we can come back to that. Story 3. When I was a theology professor, and I taught, for 1 year, I was the visiting professor in Portland, but I also taught adjunct for a number of years in, New York. One of the most helpful things that I ever came up with to help students who were gonna go into ministries of various kinds, to think about power, was to use a musical arrangement, to use the analogy of a musical score. So, when you ask somebody about a song, almost exclusively, they're gonna talk to you about the words. If you said, "Tell me about that song." But actually, the truth is if you take away the words, the song remains, because the words are almost an icing on the cupcake, right? They're not the structure, they're not the what holds it up, right? The material. They're the decorations. In some sense, the words are the decorations in music sometimes. To really understand music, you gotta start going down the register of harmony, the melody, the pace, the timbre, the pitch. Um, you can get into instrumentation. So a song would sound different on a harmonica than a flute, right? On a banjo than a six-string guitar. And you keep going down as you attend to the different layers, you really begin to understand the music of timbre and pace and rhythm. And almost always, sort of the thing that really powers the song, the fuel that drives it, is the bass line. And I find that when people are analyzing, whether it's institutions or movements or moments, that the issue of power is often neglected. The words get almost all of the attention. What did he say? Or even what did he do? But the behind the scenes motivation of power and control is often invisible to people. It's either assumed or it is not accounted for, and therefore it goes unattended. And so when I listen to the news or read theology or, I'm at a denominational gathering, the issue of power is front and center to me. Who's in charge? What do they want to do with the influence that they have? Is this a um, issue of control? Is this an issue of dominance? Is it an issue of influence? Is it an issue of profit? Like what's driving this thing? Because I find that in our gatherings, whether they're rallies, like political rallies, worship services, denominational, let's say clergy conferences, seminary classrooms, the dinner table in your home, that power is the baseline of whatever song is being broadcast. But the words get the majority of the attention. And I see evidence of what has happened over the last 3 months, that when I ask my question that I started this with, why don't my friends and family seem to care? Right? There's nothing you could say that would convince them to not support this guy. All the evidence is there. The words have been presented in multiple medias. There's something else going on. And so that is my working theory as to the moment that we find ourselves in, is that while the words get a lot of attention, because there are a lot of words and they're inflammatory and they're scary and they're chaotic, but the song that's being played right now, those are just decorations, right? Those are window dressing in some sense. There's something else going on. I'm not talking about the candidate. I'm talking about why my friends and family support him. And I think that the issue is power and control. So those are my stories, and I would love to circle back and chew on them with you. My musical orchestration analogy of there's something unaccounted for, and it's why
Mhm.
so many progressive, liberal, lefty, libertarian types got blindsided by this thing, is that what's really driving it is is underneath. It's a deeper register.
It's all about that bass.
I'm all about the bass.
I guess it works for both versions of bass
Yeah.
with 2 S's or an S and an E at the end, you know?
Ooh.
The, okay, so, um, maybe we work backwards. So
Okay.
you tell here's something that kind of, like, comes to mind when thinking about that bass thing, um, and I think part of it is, um, the overwhelming majority of people in America have an inherent suspicion and distrust of institutional power,
Mhm, mhm.
be it political or economic or these
Yeah.
kinds of things. And the ones left that have it are the ones that watch MSNBC, which is and CNN. Like it is baby boomers
Yeah.
and older who lived and voted in a time where they thought, wow, we're making progress. Look at
Yeah.
the bipartisan consensus. We love norms. And so because there's this larger context of material anxiety, and like one element of like what is the base is a growing material anxiety where the
Mm.
number of people who think their kids will do as well as they did, or that they could do as well as their parents is just inherently smaller. And as that became a reality in the 80s, and as the percentage of our population as a nation who kind of matches the diminishing horizon intergenerationally grows, the percentage of people who wake up to that and then all of a sudden are freaking out is higher. And I definitely think that there's the kind of leadership of the Democratic Party are kind of like the last ones on the boat of we have a thriving project to manage and sustain. So then the moment and this is true about plenty of my friends that are much more on the Bernie Sanders side of life, when you hear them talking about like we have to preserve democracy or blah 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 blah, and you're like, yeah, but we're funding a genocide. We didn't extend child tax credits. You screwed up and we're slow playing credit debt. You have drilled more than any president in our own time. You're being like, you just start going through the list and you're like, I have no idea what reality you are talking about. It's just that you're technically in charge right now and you're hoping for affirmation when there's a list of doors you could walk through and you could just name the struggle. But instead, you're going to run around and tell us we have to keep the institution together. And you're like, for what? Who's it helping? Your retirement plan? Right. And so you take that just on like half of the more progressive side.
Yeah.
You stick it on the right. Well, you know what are the conditions in which anyone can not have like a shrinking horizon intergenerationally? It is the people that win the game by leaving their home and joining the and essentially joining the professional class or the managerial class, which there are less options on that, but there are fewer of them. But what does that mean? You go to these cities, you go get degrees, you go to the cities, you're joining through these hoops. And that means the people that aren't doing it are at home feeling more of that material anxiety. And then who is it that's stewarding culture are the few that keep making it through. So I think that generates where you get that similar frustration in a growing number of the population, be it more progressive people looking at the Democratic Party going, really? You didn't think that Joe Biden couldn't run again? And you are giving me crap for going, it's probably good to run someone that has back-to-back complete sentences? I'm just saying, you can't complain to me on Twitter for 6 months. Then he has a horrible debate. And then you just come to see the light and you're going to shame me after it because I'm like worried we shouldn't be funding a genocide and should probably like actually support the economics, and economic populism. So that's all. But on the right, it's even more intense in places. And then the one time their energy gets expressed, then like the dominant culture, which doesn't mean dominant power center, but the dominant culture basically just shames them, tells them they're stupid, racist, bigots, homophobes, blah, 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 blah. Right. And so underneath it, I think that there's like when material reality isn't something we even think politics can do, then what is the through line?
Yeah.
What's the through line? And I think we're at a place where we have created in an increasingly kind of post-religious context, one where the identity question is significantly at the center.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of cyclical ugliness where what started on the left, on more progressive spaces around identity politics, that the individual is the one who's the authority of their own self-understanding, and to identify yourself, locate yourself, describe yourself, true self, whatever language you want, to share it is then placing on the other an ethical obligation to recognize them in their otherness and difference. And then, we need to protect it. And then capitalists come up with a way to market to it and monetize it. But the progressive side generates this ethics of authenticity where kind of recognition of one's self identity puts an ethical obligation on the other.
Yeah.
Now, if you just harness that, then that baseline that you can see, I think, is that same expectation is being seized by a growing number of people who experience progressive people's resentment and contempt for them culturally. So then you ask that question, why don't they care about Trump and blah, 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 blah? I think they're looking like, this is who I am. And you have to recognize me in my MAGA-ness, or me in my resentment, or me in my kind of Christian dominionist, or me in this.
Yeah.
And you're ethically obligated to allow it to have space.
Yeah.
You're telling me it doesn't fit in democracy or doesn't fit in America, where there's more of us than there are of you. So screw you. We're going to elect the train wreck, and he's going to nominate a dude who committed international sex trafficking
Yeah.
as the attorney general. That's what we're going to do. Right.
Yeah.
And so to me, part of that baseline is a culture that lacks the ability for the affirmation of each other apart from the valuation of the other, generates this cycle of resentment and contempt. In recognition of the other in their otherness without valuation is something that each of the religious traditions in different ways do. But for Christians, right, like it's a valuation that regardless of the other, there could be the enemy and they're made known and loved completely by God. But once you make the recognition something that the affirmation of you in your otherness only comes from a finite creature, then it levels up the anxiety. And this is Tripp's version of like saying back to you what I was thinking. And
yeah,
go ahead.
So this is great. So couple reflections. I just want to pick up. You mentioned the post-millennial thing of I think dominion. You said the word dominion. When I talked about 100 years ago, one of the most fascinating changes is that in the 1910s, that first decade of the 1900s, 20th century, I think it was something like 86% of churches identified as post-millennial, right? And then after in this crisis that we talked about between the world wars, by the 60s or 70s, I don't remember the study now, it was down to like 8%. It went from like 86 to like 8 or 6, something. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but it was a very small minority. Well, the reason I tracked this is because when I became a charismatic Christian, one of the furthest out groups in charismatic Christianity believed in something called dominion theology. Well, it turns out that dominion theology is the remnant, the leftover from the demise of post-millennialism. And so it came in and was popularized in this ideology called the 7 mountains theology of society. And the goal is to be in control of those 7 mountains of media, education, healthcare, right? I forget what the 7 mountains are, but it's fascinating that I have been warning my liberal and progressive friends for over 20 years that this remnant, like as much as we roll our eyes at the idea of the Christian century and Christians, ratifying culture, that old zombie is still around and is coming back to life in a different form called dominion theology. So there's an issue of control there that we can touch on. The other thing I really like that you pointed out, one of the things that made me think of is ever since in 2010, when I moved down to Claremont and I got a job at the United Methodist Church in West LA, I've been interacting with people both in the academy at Claremont and in the church setting who were wildly liberal. And it was refreshing to me at first because up to that point in my life, Tripp, I was always the furthest left of anyone in any room. And I sort of got tired of being the unicorn or the anomaly. But then once I found myself surrounded by true leftists and liberals, I realized I'd rather be the most liberal person in a room than be at whatever this Woodstock hate Ashbury thing was, where you really, we call it liberal laryngitis. You can't say much of anything without offending somebody. It was so wild. And but since then, in 2016, when I moved up to Portland and was at a wildly liberal congregation there too, one of the things I've been constantly trying to convince my progressive liberal leftist friends of is that we're not playing the same game. So when we say things like, the other side of the aisle, or right, however we phrase it, it almost sounds like we're just two halves of a same coin, right? And it gets called the horseshoe theory. Like the further left you go, the more you start sounding like the right or whatever, right? And I just wholly disagree with this altogether. In fact, when you say, we're talking apples and oranges, I think no. It's more like apples and hammers. Like we're just not even talking about the same thing. And it's one of the reasons why we talk past each other so much. So, like in the abortion debate, the gun control debate, the whatever it is, people are so entrenched in their talking points that you can't even hear what the other side is saying, right? And I just don't. But here's my favorite example. My lefty friends say things like, silence is violence. So being silent, right, creates a atmosphere, culture where people feel emboldened and this can lead to violence. Okay. It's not a great slogan. And I've been saying to people who say such things, I live in a very woke world. And so I find myself saying things like, that's actually not true. And more specifically, on the other side, they don't believe silence is violence. They believe violence is violence. And then when January 6th happened and that cohort almost took over, right, and pulled off the coup, I said, we got to stop saying things like silence is violence, because we're up against an opponent, if you will, for which there's the actual tangible, you use the word material, I think, reality of violence. So one is a word-based economy. Liberals are a word-based economy. You say the right thing, you check the right box on the census, right? Next to the word white or Caucasian or Asian or African American. We're very word-based. And part of the reason that version of progressive or liberal politics, this is why I love what you're saying about if we don't address the material reality, what we end up doing is word policing or tone policing, right? And making sure that people say the right thing and check the right box. And the demand when it comes to this word economy, the demand for 100% loyalty or purity. It's a purity check, right? And I recognize this from my days of being evangelical. If you were thoroughly evangelical but had the wrong eschatology, you would get discounted. Or if you were thoroughly evangelical but you listened to secular music, you could be discounted, right? The ideological purity test on the left reminds me so much of my upbringing in conservative evangelicalism. They feel very similar to me. So, like when I'm at a clergy conference and before we're allowed to speak, we have to use 6 identifiers, right? Including pronouns and, right, so many other things. And now the Methodists, at our most recent one, there was a memes going around about how we had to say if we were a young adult, an adult, or an older adult, or something like that. And people said, we've gone too far. We've gone too far. This has gotten ridiculous. And it was just one of those things that helped me to show my congregation, like, this approach to corporate life together, community, is a snake eating its own tail, because when you demand allegiance and purity in your vocabulary, right? One of the things that happens on the other side is that they call it grievance politics, right? I once heard Andrea Smith call it the oppression Olympics, right? So that's on the left. That's what they call it. But when that grievance permission migrated across the aisle, I'm using air quotes here, it became a Frankenstein version of itself where people felt aggrieved. And because evangelicals have this persecution complex, right? And I know where that comes from. I grew up in that. Like in 8th grade, my first concert I ever got to go to was a Striper concert.
Yeah.
And I bought a concert t-shirt and I wore it to school the next day that said, "To hell with the devil."
Oh, I had that T-shirt.
And I got sent down to the office because of separation of church and state. And my mom
Because
had
of the separation.
you can't wear religious stuff at
You
school.
were like, look, they're wearing spandex. There's no space for separation in this.
I did. I actually pointed out my buddy sitting next to me had a Blue Oyster Cult shirt on.
Yeah.
I was like, why is he allowed to wear that? It's a rock concert, right?
Yeah. And it's a cult. It's a cult.
I did. I said that. I did say that.
And oysters. Think of the problem of biological magnification.
The bivalves.
They're just sitting there at the bottom collecting all the mercury.
So my mom had to bring me a different shirt and I wouldn't wear it because I ended up wearing it because my mom told me to, but I didn't want to wear it because in my Christian youth group, we had learned that you cannot be ashamed of your faith and that when people do stuff like this, it's persecution, right? This is the beginning of the tribulations because we live in the end times, right?
Yeah, it's somewhere in Revelation about the striper shirt.
It's the striper shirt. So when grievance, though, migrated, let's say in the last 10 years, across the aisle and met the evangelical persecution complex, it became a Frankenstein version that was no longer accountable to the creator, right? It had a life of its own at this point. So
Similar to kind of like postmodern theories of truth. And let me tell you about how big my how big my gathering was.
yeah,
Like, I have alternative facts.
alternative facts. So listen, when things migrate, like identity politics no longer means what it used to, right? So you have to differentiate between the popular use of it and the original use of it. Deconstruction. Almost everyone who says the word deconstruction means demolition or destruction. They're not doing deconstruction. And or they'll talk about, when I was in my deconstruction phase, and I'll say whether or not it wasn't deconstruction, when things migrate out of the academy or out of a collective, like a commune, right? Like identity politics, and they get into the popular culture, they get distorted, right? They not only get diluted, they get distorted and become something else. And this grievance thing has migrated and has become something entirely different.
Oh, yeah. One of the things, and I'm interested in, let me try, I'll try to ask this question because I know you and Randy, in your book on decolonizing evangelicalism.
You read our book?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks for reading that.
Well, you're welcome. But one of the challenges that exist, especially for evangelicals, is the way kind of inherited concepts of identity set you up to interpret the present, and then how you get these kind of like migrations of contemporary tropes that have political power when you leverage them, get utilized. But it seems to me that one of the first things you pointed out is the way you get these concept creeps, right? Like silence is violence. And why that gets put there, right, is that the recognition, and this is something that's definitely true, like the way we use language to interpret the world also shapes our pre-conscious valuation of reality, right? So there is a way that our language, our harbors in it kind of like a grid for interpreting existence. So when there are judgments that exist in language, or distinctions that one side is good and the other side's bad, or evaluative things, or just watch like the tension that comes up the moment anything that has a historic legacy of binary is problematized. These kind of things work.
Okay.
But so like part of the reason there's concept creep is for those that recognize that by expanding the recognition of violence to include kind of the culture of harm generated in this language. So we want to expand it. So we're being honest that if you walk around and when guys are all together, they will perform patriarchy with each other, then keep quiet when they're around females and do this, you're actually legitimating to each other patriarchal patterns of relationships that get preserved.
Wow.
And so it's like part of that, the silence is violence, or the concept expanding of the concept is to recognize how social we are as creatures, and that our material relations are shaped by the culture we're in. And so there's this recognition for it, but then I think there's a second stage of it, which is, I think, where you were pointing out, no, violence is violence, in the sense that, look, there's one thing for doing that, but it's very different when you hit the person, right? And so a lot of times when we feel like we're alienated from the shaping, when one group feels alienated from the shaping of political realities, they turn to culture to start to control or shape the minds of people to get the reality at once. Others, when they don't think they can win culture, on the right here, go to politics, and they're going to shape the material conditions to get what they want. And so one of the tensions at play is, like, in the same way that those of us with humanities degrees will be more attending to the way culture shapes material reality.
Yeah.
For those that are experiencing that as a threat, and it generates an understanding, which is oftentimes true, of a deep judgment of them by the other, then it's like, well, if this is really just a battle for recognition, for who gets to interpret the world, then maybe we should lean in to the way the Senate's structured. Maybe we should pack a Supreme Court. Maybe we should do X, Y, and Z, because these tools are being used against us. So I feel like they're part of the inherent antagonism of our moment is that there are groups of people that feel so alienated from the commons, the collective whole, that the other's vision of the common good excludes them, and that their place in the world is they've become a non-person, be it the a trans kid who wants to play sports, or like a plumber who's really bitter that he can't pay his bills and lost a contract to a company that had showed the right amount of diversity. And that guy's at my cigar lounge, and I've listened to him.
I know that guy
with fear and trembling, because he also has an assault rifle in his car. So
I met that guy at the golf course the other day, by the way.
Yeah. So to me, one of the elements under this is what happens when you no longer see the common good as something that's shared with people you may not. You could see someone in the common as an opponent ideologically, but the collective project is something we all do together. And it seems to me that there's growing percentage of people on the political left and right, which would all be kind of center to right in the rest of the West, but nonetheless, who their vision of the commons is experienced by the other side as not including them. Right. And so what was the ad ran most against Kamala is two transgender illegal immigrants that got a surgery in a prison, even though she was obeying the law while Trump was president. But that doesn't matter, because what was the point was this, right? So and then what do the other side's like, he doesn't even like democracy or this kind of thing. Both of these get experience when you're watching how the other side talks about you, is that the future they imagine for this country is where you aren't in it. And that levels up this energy that is just uncomfortable. And I think that's, I think that to ask, like, what is the, when a person talks about the common good, is their enemy included in it or not?
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And I'll just say, that if you were a Christian, there's not a lot of wiggle room.
Right.
Because while we were yet sinners.
Mm.
So
enemies of God.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. The Logos comes into its own, and they knew him not. And he wasn't like, Jesus is like, bump this. These people be crazy. Screw them. I'm building a new ark.
A new ark. Have you ever heard Eddie Izzard's take on Jesus? We call it the second coming, but actually what we now call the first coming was actually the second coming. That the first time God sent Christ to earth, it was during the age of the dinosaurs, and it didn't go very well. It's a really funny bit if you've never seen it. Hey, I just want to clarify something, and I appreciate your circling back to this. So, for the record, I want to clarify. I believe that silence does create an atmosphere that facilitates or incubates violence.
Yeah, that's why I was making mention of your book.
I know, I appreciate it.
It's analyzing just how much violence exists in a colonialist Christianity.
Thank you. What I was trying to say, probably very clumsily, is when I think about my friends and family in Montana and Ohio and in other places in Western Canada, what does that sound like to them? I was trying to reflect what it sounded like to them.
Yeah.
So, like, and I should just say, I believe in identity politics. I think that somebody should bring their whole person and their social location in solidarity for political influence and leverage. So I believe in identity politics. So I was trying to say, what does it sound like to my relatives and my family around the country? And then the third one is deconstruction. Big fan of deconstruction. I just don't like when post-evangelicals or ex-evangelicals, how they use it. So just for clarity, I'm I'm on board. Side note, before this election trip, I don't know if so when I moved to a new community, people wonder about my politics. And the most helpful thing I have found to tell people is that I don't believe in partisan politics. I'm something you've never heard of, which is a social constructivist and a communitarian almost. And so I said, the most helpful thing I can tell you is that for me, Bernie was a good compromise. Because people don't understand that, like, this current Democratic offering is so centrist.
Yeah.
Right? And
maybe not centrist, it's corporatist. That's the part of it that drives me up a wall. I'm just like, we literally are baptized into an allegiance of someone that has one single binary. You can serve God or mammon. The rest of it, it's like you got to work this out with integrity.
Well, you're going to start quoting the Bible. I mean,
yeah.
Have you ever had
you're quoting the Bible and suggesting the platform of a secular Jew?
Have you ever had somebody discount you because you quote the Bible?
Yeah.
This happens to me all the time. Somebody will go, well, if you're going to quote the Bible, I mean, you know it better than I do. I'm like, then freaking listen to me.
Well, it's just like, if you're going to reference the Bible and they get uncomfortable while telling you what a true Christian is, that's when it gets weird. I have no problem trying to articulate my values without quoting it. It's just, if you're claiming the Christian high ground and then going, okay, well, I know Jesus may have said that, but in 2 Kings, I was like, you mean one of the kings that are condemned by the prophets?
Yeah, prophets. Ugh. They are not. The thing that a lot of people don't know about prophets, I love the prophets. They make me so uncomfortable, But the two things I find myself saying the most about the prophets is, prophets aren't primarily telling the future. They're telling the truth in interesting ways. That's a quote I found that I've used hundreds of times. But the other thing about the prophets is, they're not into conservation or what's the other word? They're not conservative, right? The prophets don't have a conservative vision of retaining the present status quo, right?
Well,
they're not institutionalists.
No. If they, well, except the ones the kings would keep in the court. right? Like, it was like,
Yeah.
Jeremiah, I need you to update
I
your talking
yeah.
points. And Jeremiah's like, no. He's like,
Nope.
then I'm going to get myself a new prophet.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Preservationists, that was it. They're not preservationists or conservationists. That's what they're saying.
yeah, the do you think the okay? So you wrote when y'all wrote when y'all are exploring the need to decolonize
Yeah.
evangelicalism, it was at a much earlier period in whatever you want to call the metastasized growth that currently happened. And one of the features, at least so far from exit polls, is that even in ethnic minority populations in America
Yep.
that move more towards Trump, you're more likely to move that way if you are Christian than not.
Yeah.
So I wonder, as
Yeah.
like, because part of what you're looking at in the book is even the way kind of white evangelicalism has been exported to other communities
Yeah.
and such, and seeing how it was significantly less successful in America at infiltrating Christian within the black church
Mhm.
in America, but in other minority populations, if you identify as Christian, you're more likely to be one of those that switched um, voting. I wonder, like, the kind of conversations you and Randy had at that previous time, like what pops up now, and or you can try to talk him in just to come and hang out with us and y'all talk about it.
Yeah, no, oh, boy. Yeah, I would love to get his take on this. I haven't talked to him since the election. Um, and he travels a lot, so he gets to interact with, you know, lots of different people of different persuasions. So I would love to get his take on this. Maybe I'll give him a shout. Uh, I am stuck between two thoughts. I was joking earlier that people will often say, well, if you're going to quote the Bible, this isn't going to be fair because you know it so much better than me. It just dawned on me, Tripp, that's my musical word picture. That's my analogy. I don't care about the words. Like you have better words than I do. So they're not they're not tempted to bite that worm because it will cause them to be pulled out of whatever this position of power, right? The words are just a distraction at that point. Like when I heard myself say that when I was joking, it dawned on me, oh my gosh, they're saying, let's not do words. You have better words than I do. I'm not going to do that. I'm already where I want to be, and I don't want you to move me. I don't want to lose that argument because I like this where I'm seated in power here. I feel powerful in this position. It's really crazy. Um, the other thing I'm thinking is here's a fun story. At my dad's memorial this past March, it was a very evangelical affair, but like a beautiful version of it. It was like a really, really nice expression. And my siblings who had grown up in that area, because they moved there after high school. I was stayed in Canada. They moved back to New York. My siblings all invited their friends, from Philadelphia and from New York and New Jersey. And so afterwards, I asked my siblings, like, hey, did you get any good feedback from your friends about the memorial? And they said, yeah, everyone thought it was really beautiful. And obviously it was like really, really appropriate, because that's who dad was. But everyone was taken back a little bit by how much his name was dropped. And I said, yeah, I noticed that too. And I said, I haven't been in those circles in a while, but I don't remember it being that Jesus heavy, right? It was almost overkill. So I called the guy who conducted the memorial, who facilitated it for us. And I said, hey, quick question. I was debriefing with my siblings and their friends and all of them, me and my siblings, we all noticed, like, we don't remember that many invocations of Jesus's name. It seemed a little Jesus centric, like a little overkill. He told me the most interesting thing. And this is why, by the way, if you're an outsider to a group, there are things, in-house conversations that are going on, like inside baseball, you just cannot anticipate, right? He said, that is our attempt, those of us who are Christ followers, that is our attempt to put the focus back on Jesus and away from Trump. We're losing our churches to MAGA. And that is our attempt to bring it back so that the focus is on Jesus. And I thought, if you put me in a room and gave me $1,000, I couldn't have come up with that.
Mhm.
So evangelicalism is changing even for evangelicals. So without being an insider anymore, I am not sure that I have insight about the in-house division happening over there. Isn't that an interesting story?
Yeah. Yeah, mm. You know what's fascinating? And
What?
obviously, pragmatically, I understand why people do this because they're thinking, what happens to me if I'm clear, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm clear in this context about the biggest threat I see growing to the integrity of our deepest commitment to Christ as Lord, Trump. Like, if I just go, hey, I was talking to a lot of my peers as clergy, and we have a deep concern that a lot of you are being radicalized to abandon your ultimate allegiance to Christ and
Whoa.
rendering it towards the MAGA movement. So I just want you to know, every time I say Jesus, it's because, like, I'm really worried about that. Now, I'm not saying I'm perfectly, like, clear on everything. It's just, as someone ordained to the gospel, I'm worried about some rampant idolatry, and I don't know the solutions to it, so I'm just gonna say Jesus a lot.
Oh my god.
So when you start hearing it, just know I'm squeezing it in more often because I'm hoping you'll think about it, right? Like, you say that with your peers, then you go do it, but you don't tell anyone, because you already know that, like, you're having that fear because you know they've already drank the Kool-Aid, right? So you
Mm.
aren't just going to go be like, as your brother or sister in Christ, like, I just wanna let you know this. You're like, let me, let me just say Jesus more, and maybe the Holy Ghost to cast out them demons, and it's so, like, knowing that, that it's fascinating to me, and this is the same thing's actually true among mainline clergy because I end up interacting with quite a few of them in classes and getting emails of this, the like, what does what does kind of like intentional leadership look like when the wave, or the cultural wave of the moment, is creating more and more distance between you and the people you care about, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, if you draw closer to them, think of, like, you're at the ocean, right? So if you're staying, let's say you're staying grounded, so, like, you're not getting pulled out by the undertow, but if your congregation is slowly getting pulled further and further out, then it's like, what is going to save them look like? If I get
Right.
too far away from them and they know it, they're gonna see me as an enemy.
That's
If
right.
I get too close, or how do I go to save them? How
Yeah.
do I try to invite them back to grounding? Like, or are they getting pulled out by these tides? And by the time they realize that we're so far apart, if I even
Yeah.
let them know what's going on, they'll see me as an enemy. So that kind of, like, move of, like, the wave and then slowly pulling people out, that dynamic. And it was a Methodist clergy who used that in an email to
Huh.
me. And she was like, like, I thought I was being clear, and then here's what happened. Now
Oh,
there's, like, half the church picks up on it, and half the church is
wow.
important to them, and they're sitting here with me. And now the others are so far off, they're like, you need to tell them to go to hell in Jesus' name, or you need to tell them, right? And she's
Sure.
like, I don't know what to do. And it seems like a rather hopeless situation.
Yeah.
And, like, in some sense, you don't have a lot of control of the tides and
Right.
that, but it is fascinating how many churches have leaders who are clear about their assessment of the moment in places that are ambiguous when talking to
Mm,
the people they're leading.
mm,
And their justification for their ambiguity, I think, reveals more anxiety about their place in the institution than their integrity before God. But I don't want
right.
it to mean like in a critical way. I
Yeah.
I got I basically picked one out of every 4 sermons to say what I was really thinking. When working at a church full of people that work for the military industrial complex. I didn't do it every time.
Yeah.
I found like 1 out of 4, then more would hear it and more would respond. And if it was
Yeah.
more frequent, then I thought health insurance. And that
Couple
was,
Yeah.
before this. And that
Right.
was a
Right.
UCC church in Los Angeles, not a red state in a red county.
So a couple of things as we round the corner towards the finish line here. It's funny how dog whistles don't work in reverse. So I'm being serious.
No, I know.
So ever
I swear Bo's like it's like he takes a breath and he's like, I have an image.
So ever since I read the book Dog Whistle Politics, I've been trying to use dog whistles in positive ways. Like for those who have ears to hear, they'll hear it, right? But they don't carry the same power. People think that you're
Yeah.
being ambiguous and elusive. It doesn't work. I wish you could use positive dog whistles, but unfortunately, it doesn't ring the same way. So that's one thing.
If you try to give them and then you get follow-up questions, I remember I had someone come to my office and I said positive dog whistles, which I think they heard it, but not because not how I wanted. And and this was an executive at Raytheon, who was, what did you put in our prayer of confession?
Uh-oh.
Um,
Uh-oh.
the use of drones to kill innocent children. And I was like, yeah, because I paid for it. He's like, well, I built it, and we had this conversation and he's like, he's giving me like the pragmatic, explanation of
Yeah.
how the military industrial complex, the post World War II essential role of America, going through this whole thing. He's like, what do you think? Like an individual just gets to decide this or this or this. And like, and I was like, nope, I just assume, if there's a purgatory, I'm getting extended time already for what my tax money is up to. And I'm way too attached to the questions I don't have to worry about that kid is never even going to get to think about. So we should at least confess it, And he just looked at me like, what makes you think, was his question, that people want to spend an hour on their weekend being reminded of how many dead people there are just so they don't have to worry what happens to their kids when they go to school. And I was just like, I don't know. I know I feel like some sense more present in the world if there's at least an hour where we're honest about the structures we don't really have agency in but are entangled in. But I'm sure there are plenty of people that'd like to avoid it. And I know about 40 places I promise it will be avoided within driving distance. But it was one of those moments, right, where I thought this was like a subtle thing. It was just one of the things in a litany in confessions, and it came up, and he basically was just like, I know what you're saying. It's true. And if I was worried about that, and Matt, and I'm like, oh.
Yeah. No, ever since 2014, I have had an internal wrestling match as a minister. Do we give people a break from the news for an hour on Sunday morning, maybe 2 if they're in Sunday school? And in that sense, we are supplemental, right? We're like a multivitamin, but we're not the main diet, right? The main diet is 24-hour news cycle and the internet, and we're supplemental. Or do we create a context and a culture where we can have these conversations and in that sense be not supplemental, but really house and be the place that you engage the topic, right? And so substantial, I would call it. And I I then that was 2014. So in 2017, I got appointed to a church in Portland, and and Trump had been elected the first time in 2016 while I was a professor, and then I had to ask the question all over again. Like, do we give people a vacation from this parade of news, if you want to call it that, or do we create the place where we address it? And I go back and forth all the time. And now I'm in Southern Idaho where, it's the exact inverse of, in these national elections of Portland, where 84% voted one way and 16 another. Here it's the exact inverse, 84 the other way. And so the people who come to our congregation, they're very aware of what's going on. So do I give them a break from that and not talk about this stuff and give them something else? Or is this the place where we take it on and tackle the issue? So I wrestle with this all the time. And I have to be honest, I understand from people's perspective that it's nice to come and get a little break from the chaos and conflict in the world. But then I'll be honest, man, I feel like, if my job is to give them a little vacation and to be supplemental, and we're never going to address the material realities of people's lived existence, then I don't know what we're doing here. And so I get the pull of the therapeutic. I really do. But if we don't have a prophetic component, right? Or even a messianic vision, an alternative, then I'm like, I don't know, it feels like a waste. I don't want to say it's a waste of time, but it's not as powerful as it could be.
Mm,
And so the thing that I've taken to is just reminding people, well, the evidence that we have in the Christian New Testament is of a minority community with a subversive agenda. And maybe it's not the worst thing in the world for us to take on that posture again as a minority community with a subversive agenda.
mhm. So that now, I was just editing the next episode for the Rise of Bonhoeffer and finding like clips out of his writing and stuff. So here's one.
All right.
This will be my conclusion. Then you say whatever you want to wrap
All
up.
right.
But this is what it pops in mind because he actually talks about this. Um, and he said, if grace is a principled presupposition in my Christian life, then in advance, once I have justification of whatever sins I commit in my life in the world, I can now sin. On this basis of grace, the world is in itself justified. I thus remain as I was before in my bourgeois secular existence, with like a little Jesus grace on top. Everything remains as it was before, and I can be sure that God's grace takes care of me. The whole world has become Christian under this grace, but Christianity has come to be under the world as never before. Is the price we are paying today with the collapse of organized churches anything else but the inevitable consequences of grace acquired too cheaply?
Oh, mama.
And that to me is like a feature that shows up in a number of the stories we've talked about, especially the ones related to all these different clergy situations, is the way
Mm.
Protestantism on steroids takes grace and then extends it to the world as it is. So the world as it is never given the call to obedience. And when the call to obedience is kind of alienated from the proclamation of grace in the life of the church, then we become like the words of the song, Bo. It's just the flavor running on top, but the base is the same world that crucified Jesus and crucifies people to this day, like the energy that's in it. And so then what does it look like to wrestle with that seriously? And for Bonhoeffer, one of the things he kept insisting on was that to attend to Christ in the present is to meet the face of the other as the face of Christ. And that the other who is experiencing deep grief, sorrow, injustice, suffering, comes with all the more obligation for compassion, care, and solidarity. And that, so, that's a different way of then asking how we do this difficult task, right? Because in some sense, right, then in actually the next chapter in Cost of Discipleship after that quotes after is where he goes, well, then what does Jesus mean when he says my burden is light? But the burden is light is not about obedience, forsaking obedience. It's about the sheer freedom of recognizing all that was ever demanded of you and required of you has come. So you get to follow in obedience. It's not like a demand where you're insufficient or like insignificant or you got to work your way up to this or that. No. Is it all a finite existence has been seized by a loving God who's refused to be God without us. And so what is more enlivening? What expresses the freedom of this love more deeply than solidarity with those who the material reality and their experience in the world doesn't reflect the actual reality in the crucified and risen Christ, namely the initiative of a God who's refused to be God without them. And so to me that is like an extremely challenging word, but it is one I think a lot more Christians could recognize as distinctly Christian. And then we have the conversation of then what does it look like to hold us accountable?
Yeah.
Because for Bonhoeffer, he's like, look, God has already claimed the world in Christ. Like God gave God's self, is reconciling it all. So if that has been the promise, then what do we do about it? And it's hard to think that if the ultimate reality of our broken world is reconciliation with God, that our allegiances would be to the very mechanisms that preserve alienation, exploitation, and justice. What fidelity looks like, that's going to be so dependent on different situations and things. But I think it's fascinating to me that when he saw even the confessing church movement compromising, he thought this is a result of cheap grace, a vision of the gospel where how do you recognize grace without recognizing your solidarity with the face of the other? He goes, then whatever that is, you think grace is ultimately about baptizing a social, political, culture, economic world, or the privilege of the present, or whatever that you're trying to preserve, and not calling us towards we aren't being called into the same kind of solidarity with, suffering with, commitment to movement that was God's coming in Christ.
Wow. Here's what I'll close with. One of the most quotable people ever, Chesterton. That famous quote, Christianity hasn't been tried and found difficult. It's been found difficult and left untried. So my prayer for us is that the Spirit of grace would lead and guide us through these tricky waters, and the undertow, the currents that are coming, because we're going to need wisdom and courage and hope and bravery um, in the days to come going forward.
And if you go camping with your friends, don't bring cigarettes.
By the way, there is one person who I guarantee is going to listen to this the first day it comes out and be horrified that I used that example.
Yeah. Well, luckily I don't know their names, so
They're going to text me within the hour.
Bo's friend, look, he says these things sometimes. Sometimes he just texts you. He's like, I have an agenda for our podcast. I'm gonna tell a story about something that happened in your garage, and then we'll go from there. And I'm like, man, there's a lot of things that happen in that garage. We'll see.
Woo, dog. All right, man. Well, I'll see you next time. I got to get ready to head to a meeting.
All righty. Talk
All
to y'all
right.
later. Thanks for hanging out, everyone that came live. And for those of you listening later.